in what we would call a feeling of Shant. Yes, there are tragic moments. Think of the great plays of Kalidasa. When Dushyanta doesn't recognize Shakuntala, it is certainly tragedy. But not, it is tragic, but it is not tragedy in the sense in which we understand tragedy as students of English literature. It's interesting for you to, at your own pace, in your free time, wonder why Sanskrit drama does not have tragedy the way English literature has tragedy as a form. Let's now move on to the concept of comedy, high and low comedy. You know, when you watch a movie, there could be places where you laugh, but you think it's a very low kind of laughter. And there could be places where you really enjoy it because you think it's very intellectual. It is comedy, but it's very intellectual. So also, when we talk about comedy as a literary form, we must distinguish between high and low comedy. What do I mean by high comedy and low comedy? I've tried to project it like a ladder. You know, you start walking and you gradually reach the top. I'm trying to project it like that. And I would say at the top, you have what is called pure comedy. You have what is called high comedy. Now, this kind of comedy could be what we call the Juvenalian. Juvenal was a famous Latin writer. The kind of comedy that he had was biting humor. That means it was like a slash of the whip. It means that the comedy was there, but the comedy was created by satire. He wanted to probably laugh at the follies, but he did not laugh at it in a very good-humored way. That is one kind of comedy where the satire is biting. It hits you. It's like a whiplash. It's like a sword piercing you, but it still is comedy. This could be a highly complex kind of comedy. It could have intellectual, or it could even be slapstick, which comes through surprise, which comes through incongruity. A difficult word, but I'm sure you can look up the meaning when you have the time. But incongruous is the coexistence of two things which really should not be together. So it's a very incongruous kind of situation. It could also be caused by out of place verbal wit. If an uneducated, illiterate person attempts to speak like a great scholar, we would call it out of place verbal wit. And this can cause great comedy. Later, I'm going to talk to you about Mrs. Malaprop and malapropism in comedy as a form of evoking laughter. On the other extreme, we have what is called low comedy. And this comes by misunderstandings, mistaken identities. It depends on action. It depends on situation. And most of the time, the themes are very trivial. Themes are very petty. Themes are very unimportant. So that is on the lower side, the lower rungs of the ladder of comedy. It could be farce, and I'm going to talk to you about farce later. It could be occurrences which are embarrassing. You know, it could be something very simple, which is very common in the comedy of manners, where you're talking about somebody and criticizing him, and he's at the door listening to all of that. So it could be a very embarrassing occurrence, or it could be an inopportune arrival. This is the distinction between high and low comedy. And even in literature, we do have both kinds of comedy. What are the methods which writers use to evoke comedy? It's important because you want the audience to laugh. What is the method that you can use? I would like to quote for you something that Aristotle said. Imitation of bad characters, bad not with respect to every sort of vice, but to ridicule only, as being a species of turpitude or deformity. This is neither painful nor destructive. Remember, in comedy, we laugh, but the person we laugh at is not filled with vice. You know, if you can distinguish between vice and virtue very simply, he need not be a very virtuous person. But when we say bad, it is an exaggerated kind of It's not bad in the sense that a villain in a tragedy is bad. You must remember that in comedy there are no extreme bad characters, just like there are no extreme good characters. The kind of hero that we talk about in tragedy would probably never be there in a comedy. What else does the dramatist do in order to evoke comedy? In order to get the comic element, one important thing is to have a happy ending. All of us go back saying God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. Along with Browning, this is what we would like to say at the end of a comedy. Everybody is happy, everybody goes home. You need to have the ability to evoke laughter. A comedy cannot be such that the reader or the spectator only smiles. He has to laugh. When you watch a comedy, when you read a comedy, there has to be an element of laughter. And as one critic put it beautifully, love gilds the scene and woman guides the plot. In comparison to a tragedy, I'll talk about it again, in comparison to a tragedy, comedy has women characters also with equal importance. Because if you think of all the tragedies of Shakespeare, for example, the protagonist, the important character, is always a male. In contrast, when we think of the comedies of Shakespeare, you would notice that what Ruskin said of Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare has no heroes, only heroines, I think applies to the comedies of Shakespeare, never to the tragedies. So my dear students, remember that you must have all this for the writer to be able to evoke laughter, to make the reader appreciate what a good comedy is all about. What else does the writer need to do? I said he has to evoke laughter. How is this laughter evoked? Number one, it could be a physical deformity, which is in the lower kind of comedy. It could be incongruity, two things existing which cannot coexist. It could be mental deformity, or it could be obsession. Remember, if you don't tread the middle path, it can cause comedy. It can cause laughter. An obsession with anything. It could be with a person. It could be with an idea. It could be with a color. It could be with an action. Somebody wanting to do that all the time. That could evoke laughter. What else do we find in comedy? You've got amusing situations. You've got ridiculous or awkward manners. People's behavior, if they are ridiculous. If somebody bends too low. If somebody is always joining his hands in pranam. If somebody is always saluting. If somebody is always combing his hair. If somebody is always playing with his watch or with his tie. All this could be awkward, could be ridiculous. The dialogues can cause laughter, and there could be farcical caricatures. Caricature. A cartoon. A cartoon, somebody with a long nose, has a much too long nose. So also there is a caricature. And sometimes in comedy, the writer is able to create caricatures. That is, they are no longer human, because a particular quality or a particular facial expression or a particular feature is exaggerated to such an extent that the moment he arrives on the scene, you feel like laughing. Think of some of the movies. I'm thinking of the very old movies of Laurel and Hardy. If they are on the scene, you cannot but laugh. So that is also a way in which comedy can be evoked. Let me now move on, my dear students, to the language of comedy. What is the kind of language that a writer needs to use? Remember, whenever we talk of tragedy, because remember, the tragic heroes are all either kings or nobles or great people, people from the high society, from the upper classes, and therefore the kind of language that they would speak would also be a kind of high language. When we think of the comedy as a form of drama, when we think of the kind of language that is used, we must remember that the writer needs to use language in such a way that he is able to evoke laughter in the reader or in the spectator. So number one, we could have comic juxtaposition. as I mentioned earlier in passing, you have one word which is total slang and the other word which is intellectual. These two words never go together, my dear students, but when they are put together in dialogue, automatically you laugh because it is so incongruous a situation. There is a comic juxtaposition. Comedy, language. It could also be deflation. And by deflation, what I mean is somebody who is expected to use good language is not able to use it. It could be, for example, and please don't laugh, it could be a teacher of English using wrong English. That would be terrible. That would be a kind of deflation. You cannot have a teacher of language mispronouncing a word in that language. I'm speaking to you in English. I could mispronounce a Punjabi word, but I should not be mispronouncing an English word. You get my point? And that is why it could be deflation. It could be diminution. What does that mean? He could reduce something which is very important, something which is very high, and make it very ridiculous and show how faulty that kind of language usage is. That could also evoke laughter. There could be exaggeration, which is the opposite of diminution. Diminution is making small of something which is big. And what is exaggeration? The exact opposite of that. You've probably heard the figure of speech hyperbole, hyperbole, as some say, and hyperbole. If you know what that is, it is speaking using much more words. Somebody has a thorn prick and you say, she shed a bucket of tears, right? That is hyperbole. That is exaggeration. To go back to movies, you can think of somebody like Charlie Chaplin. You know, the way he walked, the way he limped, the kind of trousers that he wore, and he walked onto the stage. That is a kind of way of evoking laughter. I'm using the word language, my dear students, in a much larger sense. By language, I do not mean only the spoken word. I do not mean only language in that sense. I also mean the body language, which is very important. Because if somebody walks in like a pompous man and he's a very small man, when he pretends to be what he is not, right, even that is a kind of language. I'm using language in that larger sense. Another way in which comedy can be evoked is by the grotesqueness of either characters, of situations, and you understand the word grotesque. Grotesque would be somebody who's maybe 8 feet tall, who's maybe got 3 heads. Naturally, since it is not true to life, we would consider it to be very grotesque. But even this could evoke laughter. Let's look at some of the other characteristics by which comedy, the comic effect, is achieved. We are looking at some of the ways in which this could be evoked. And here I'm talking about humor, inflation, invective, irony, incongruity. I'm going to quickly go through all this because remember, all this is an extension of what I've been saying previously to you. In the previous slide, you noticed. And this is an extension of all that. So I would like to move on to what now I'm going to talk to you about, which is actual language. And here when I talk about language, my dear students, I'm talking about language in the sense in which we use it in the classroom. And remember, I mentioned to you that I will be talking about Mrs. Malaprop again. And here I come to malapropism. The way in which a writer uses language, and here we are talking about the English language, and we're thinking of a playwright called Sheridan, and in his well-known play, he has a character called Mrs. Malaprop. And what does she do? She uses language in such a way, she uses a word which is very close to the actual word. For example, I'm sure all of you, my dear students of English language and literature, you certainly do know the word legible and you know the word eligible. You have a legible handwriting. That means I can read your handwriting. And you have an eligible bachelor. That means he's ready for marriage. And many mothers would like their daughters to marry him. eligible and legible. At one instance, the two words seem to be alike, very close in spelling, but of course with some difference. And if somebody talks about a legible bachelor or an eligible handwriting, it creates laughter. And this is what Mrs. Malaprop does all through the play. And so you have people in fits of laughter because you know that she's using a word which sounds the same but which is very, very different. So writers use this distortion of the usage of word, using a wrong word, a word which sounds like the other one but is not actually the same. It could also be encomium, where you pretend to praise a person when you are actually blaming him, her. Remember, this is one way of evoking comedy. Somebody comes very late and you don't say how late you are because that's not comedy, but you say how early you are, and then everybody else on the stage sort of sniggers or smiles, gives a wry smile. That is a way of creating comedy. All these are ways in which the writer uses language in order to create comedy on stage or even when you read it. It could also be by the use of, remember, jargon. If you have a doctor or a lawyer all the time using either medical language or the language of law, the language of courts, even that could create laughter. Comedy is also created by surprise. It could be created by understatement, the opposite of hyperbole, by wit, by satire, the juvenile kind of satire, or the Horatian kind of satire. I have been talking to you about how laughter is evoked. I'm talking to you about how comedy can be created by the writer so that he has the reader or the spectator laughing, enjoying the play. But I think, my dear students, it's very important to remember that when we think of drama as a literary form, when we think of drama as a genre, we have to remember that there was a phrase with which probably some of you are familiar, and the phrase is closet drama. Closet is not a word which we use very often today, but closet actually means a cupboard. The word that we use today is cupboard. So can I call it cupboard drama? And what do I mean by that? It means drama which is meant to be read and not to be